Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a returning guest, a very special guest. Her name is Joan Patti Munisteri. Last name is spelled Munisteri. And we spoke earlier this year, April 2025, about her book, Traveler Between Worlds. But that wasn't our first conversation. We spoke back in 2021 during COVID about her other book, Traveling Off the X. And she's kind of an international traveler. She's been all over the world, and those books reflect that. And in our last conversation in April 2025, she briefly said that she had been involved when she was at Georgetown, right? This kind of talent spotting place for people in international affairs, that she had been exposed to some mind control techniques, to generally say mind control in environment. And so it caught my eye. I've been doing a lot of research on it on my own, kind of from a more cultural perspective, which is really a part of it. But I was doing some research, and then I said, I should reach back out to Jo and see if she's available. So I'm really delighted and glad to have her back. And she also has a Substack that is covering there's so much going on in the world outside of even research, but her Substack is covering international affairs or geopolitics, and she just wrote an article about Armenia and Azerbaijan, which is in the news. It's really in the Caucasus, and I can bring up a map later, but it's this kind of almost a focal point where so many of these countries, nations, civilizations are together, which the U.S. is involved in. They just signed a 99-year lease, which I think is making people in that region a little nervous and concerned, but we can talk more about that. But our intro kind of subject matter is her experiences at Georgetown, which a lot of people may not see as kind of this epicenter of some of these things that happened, this kind of research that happened during the Cold War, but she can talk more about that. So Joan Patti Munisteri, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, William. Very pleased to be back.
Great. I know this is it's not going to be easy for you to recall this and recall some of the instances. So I would ask the listeners also to have a little patience, but these are very important things. There's more and more people who are, whether they're coming out and telling their stories, and most people wouldn't have believed them back in the day before the internet, because this is all done under, classified secrecy and all this other stuff. But you're one of them, and maybe you can lead the listeners and myself through your experiences, starting right from the beginning.
Yes, I was a transfer student to Georgetown. When I think back, during high school, I was in the Model United Nations as well as on the debate team, and I had won nationals, and nationals for high school students was at Stanford University in 1971. And I realize now that there were scouts there, people that would come talk to us about, would we consider going to different schools? Even when I was 16, I won a Model United Nations essay contest. And there was a speech contest in Washington, D.C. They paid for us to go up to Washington, D.C. And there were men there who were talking to us. My grandparents were with me at that. And my grandfather warned me. He said, just be careful, of who you talk to. And these guys, they may be having $500 suits or whatever, but be careful.
I can confirm that right away. I've been in Model UN. I've been at the place where Reagan was shot in D.C. Total talent spotting from a very young age, high school selecting process, and a lot of big wigs are in there looking at these younger teenage kids. So for into either intel careers, foreign service, future political things, this is a very much of a starting gate. So I know that for a fact.
Yes, it's true. And at the time, there weren't very many of us girls as well. 1971 was only the second year that foreign service and that the College of Georgetown University started admitting women in any significant numbers. There were less than 12% women in the Foreign Service School. I was in the Foreign Service School. When I arrived that summer, if 1972, because the first year I went to Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, Georgia. My parents didn't want me to go as far as Washington, D.C. the first year. But that summer, they were filming The Exorcist. People who may not know, there was a book by William Blatty, who was a Georgetown graduate, and there was a real exorcist, Father King, who was teaching at Georgetown University, who had been the assistant to the exorcist. Originally, it was a boy.
I'm friends with Blatty's son, by the way. I've had lunch with him, so small world. And the stairs are there at Georgetown, too.
Still
I keep interrupting. I'm sorry. But
that's right. We can have an associative conversation here. And that was quite wild because a lot of incidents happened on campus during that time. The chapel exploded in fire. There were some satanic symbols put in different places. It was I would say there was a fertile ground for a lot of spiritual forces on the Georgetown campus, which at that time had a significant number of faculty which were Jesuits. And the Jesuits were a special sect of the Catholic Church. So that was my entrance into Georgetown Foreign Service School. I lived, at that time, there were no co-ed dorms, so I lived in the female dorm, and there were many international students. I had, my first roommate was from the Ivory Coast, and they used to put us with the languages that we knew. I knew French fairly well. That was one of my languages for the Foreign Service School. She was from the Ivory Coast, spoke fluent French. And there were, my next time roommate was from Thailand. Her friends were from Laos and Cambodia. So we had a lot of mix of people from all over the world, which was a great benefit of not only being in Washington, D.C., but being with the international student body. And I had my eyes closed, I would say. Later they became wider open as to what a certain kind of, I won't put it danger. At the time, you didn't feel like you were physically in danger, but there were just a lot of people that were around that campus. It was a Vietnam War time, so you had the Berrigan brothers, you had a lot of communist sympathizing people, but you also had a lot of intel military people that were not only part of the faculty, but they were also part, in that time you didn't have all these gates and surveillance, so almost anybody could come on from the street when there was an event happening. And there was campus security, but it wasn't like it is now. And these events, I will say a feature of the Georgetown Society, I'm not talking about just Georgetown University. Georgetown is actually a section of Washington, D.C., quite a posh section in terms of very nice houses. A lot of people from the government, from foreign governments live there. And there were a lot of parties that were given. There were no cell phones in those days, so when you went to a party, unless there was press allowed, which there weren't in most of the places I went to, maybe the press would be allowed for the first 15 minutes to take pictures of Henry Kissinger and other people at the parties, but after that they had to leave. And at these parties, a lot of deals were done, a lot of recruiting was done. So the first year I was there, as a female, and not very many females, and I was kind of cute in those days. So I was invited to these parties. I talk about it in my book, Traveler Between Worlds in Details. And I didn't realize that at the parties, not only would they be offering alcohol, even if you were under 21, it wasn't really asked, your ID wasn't asked for. And there was also drugs. By drugs, I mean party drugs, what were considered party drugs in those days, which were psychedelics. There actually wasn't much weed, marijuana being smoked at these parties because these were kind of high-end parties. It was drinks and party drugs. And I was warned by a senior female who we became friends. She became a lawyer later on. And I was warned also by some members of my family who were in the intel community and watched over me to a certain extent. One of my uncles was in the Korean War and then in Navy intel for quite a few years. in DC. And they told me, just be careful, as well as my grandparents did. And she warned me that these men, because I was sort of wondering what these older guys were doing at these parties and on campus. And she said, they're the seekers, they're the recruiters. And you'll be careful and watch at the same time. They will ask you questions, but they will never answer your questions if you listen carefully. They'll redirect the conversation back to you. I started noticing that. And also I was told, don't leave your purse anywhere where you can't see it or one of us can see it. They'll go through it. And always watch what you're drinking. It's better if you drink tonic water, because sometimes they'll spike the drinks and drug you. So that was happening at the parties around Georgetown. And fortunately, I listened to that advice. I talk about in the book what happened at one party. In terms of the MK program, so we don't take too much time on just social life at Georgetown.
The background's very important. I spent a lot of time at Georgetown at a high end. I mean, my wife worked for a congressman. I was in law school. We were definitely outsiders from the West Coast, but the Georgetown set and the rich kids and the elite, really the elite are around. Like, I mixed with people I didn't know important. I had drinks with Theodore Shackley, the Bond Ghost's daughter. Once I didn't know any of the background of this stuff at the time. So I might have been very similar to you as not really an DC insider, but that undercurrent of danger and spies, international spies, people not from the US, but also from other countries is there. And it's the, military industrial complex, defense. It's a very heady environment in Georgetown. I would definitely agree with that. So
it's a very convenient location. You have the embassies there, you have the US government there, you have the military intel, you have the national security industry. Yeah. It's a focal point for all of that. You have to remember, this is in the 70s. This is the Vietnam War days. And I was the only girl on the Philademic Society debate team. Georgetown had the #1 debate team in the nation. Harvard might quibble about that, but it was between us and Harvard. Georgetown usually won. And they had a very famous coach, Unger, who originally didn't want me on the team because I was a girl. But then when I was doing well for them, he softened a bit. And when you're on the debate team, then you travel to Harvard, you travel for competitions in New York, you travel for competitions in North Carolina, other places. So that extended my network even further. And I was as well on the Model United Nations team. Only girl, again, was elected as the only female for a chairman at the National Model United Nations, which was held at the United Nations in New York. At Harvard, I'll give you an example of one Harvard competition for National Model United Nations. They would put us up in these fancy hotels. They would have an open bar. There would be a lot of these people around as well during these receptions. I know they spiked a lot of the drinks in Boston because some of the other, not only girls, but guys were drugged. I won't say names here for their family's privacy, but a lot of those people that were in there became very high up in the defense, in the government, in the national security sector later on. But we also had people like Omar Rafay from Jordan. His father was assistant to the prime minister. He became an ambassador. You had Saudi Arabian students at Harvard, but who were from families very high up in the governing of Saudi Arabia. A lot of the Middle Eastern sons would go to Georgetown, and Georgetown later got a lot of money from Qatar and other Middle Eastern governments to build a special Middle East center in Washington for Georgetown, and to build an entire campus in Doha, which later on I ended up working in Doha in my adult life. So the consequences of those networks, that money from back in the 70s, we're talking the early 70s, to now, is a very distinct progress and process when you look at it in retrospect. At the time, couldn't really see it. We're just all excited that we can meet people from different parts of the world. We could exchange ideas. In fact, at the Model United Nations, this is back in 1972, there was a staged Palestinian takeover of our entire assembly at the time, including kidnapping many of the quote-unquote college representatives of countries, including Israel and the United States, that they were against. So the role-playing was even played out at that point in the early 70s in the United States.
So you're saying there was like a false flag or something like that?
Well, Model United Nations is just a kind of a role play for university students from different countries to come together, represent their country. And sometimes you represented a different country if you're in the United States, because we couldn't have all, at that time, I think there were 190, now there's 193 to 6 countries in the world. And you represented their political stance, their economic stance. I was the secretary chairman of the Economic and Finance Committee of the United Nations. They had different committees, and then they had a General Assembly as well. And during that General Assembly, the Palestinians, representatives from Palestinians who were really from Jordan and Saudi Arabia, they came in with the keffiyeh and everything and staged a hostage capture and kept the representatives in their hotel room and had demands that we had to make. As I say, it was a complete role play. And I look back at it now, and at the time it was kind of fun being one of the negotiators to get some of those representatives out of the hotel room and get the assembly back going. But when you look at it, it was actually part of an indoctrination of what was going on.
I bet. Wow.
So from there, I was invited to a number of dean seminars. At the time, the dean of the Foreign Service was a very young Peter Crow. He was an excellent dean, and he would have dean seminars. It was very few people because it was in his office. So I don't think it was ever more than 10. It's not the same offices as they have now. It's a much bigger building now. Henry Kissinger was a frequent dean seminar visitor. You could really talk and ask questions in that small group. So I was invited and went to most of them. And then after that, I was invited to more outside events, more professional events. I remember at one I was invited to that Henry Kissinger was speaking. I wanted to stay in the back. I was just a college student, but I look back now and I was, a young, attractive female, and there weren't many. So I was put right in the front so that I could be right in front of Henry Kissinger sitting. And it was then, I will say it's my personal opinion, that I thought, what an incredibly brilliant, insidious man. And he was highly touted at that time because that was the Nixon era. He was Secretary of State. And we were all taught sort of early on protocol and who to be aware could possibly give you jobs later on, and what the narratives, we didn't call it narratives in those days or agendas, but what the policies were to be aware of. We were very well trained. We had excellent professors. It wasn't that long after World War II in the 70s. And so a number of the professors had incredible stories of bravery and courage during World War II and were hired by Georgetown. Georgetown had better vetting and hiring in those days than they do now. I'll say it as an alum. And so maybe people have heard of Dr. Jan Karski from Poland. He was a Christian who worked for the government in Poland before it fell to the Nazis. He spoke, I think, 6 languages, a remarkable person. Terrible story. I mean, he was arrested by the SS. He was about to be taken to, I think, a concentration camp. He was, yes, there he is. There's Peter Crow.
Yeah, still around.
Yes, he is. And Dr. Jan Karski had been tortured for helping the Jewish people escape. He had been castrated without the use of anesthesia. His wife was a Holocaust survivor, a ballerina who ended up unfortunately committing suicide. And he just had a terribly difficult life. And his eyes, I can still remember every time I go on the campus, because they have a statue to Jan Karski on the main campus now in bronze of him playing chess. It's pretty apropos. But he would look at you from across the campus sometime, from across the yard, and his blue eyes were just so piercing. They were just full of, you knew, memories he could never probably talk about. But he felt it very important to teach, and he was an excellent teacher. I had Dr. Wasowski, also from Poland, Dr. Gunther Ruff from Germany. We're talking about people who had survived the horrors of World War II, and some of them did work with the former OSS and became CIA, if not contractors, then let's say assets. And I won a fellowship in 1973 to travel behind the Iron Curtain. It's a lengthy story I won't go into now. I do talk about it on Ryan Rogers and Maureen's Choice is Not Chances podcast. You can listen to the full details there. But after going behind the Iron Curtain in 1973, going to Bucharest under Ceausescu, going through Checkpoint Charlie, going to Russia, I realized that what was being taught on campus by not the professors, many of them were anti-communist, anti-Nazi, but by the infiltrators that were there during those protests against the Vietnam War, that Russia and the Soviets were supposed to be a paradise for workers, each according to their own abilities, according to their own needs. And then I actually go behind the Iron Curtain and realize it's not that way at all. They're very behind economically. Oh, the women have jobs, all right, but there's street sweepers and assistants. And that really opened my eyes to the wider world. I had to go on my own. When I returned, then I was invited to be in a special program. And the first time that they were going to offer a course called Psycho-Cybernetics. And the professors who were professionals, not just professors at Georgetown, that came in from outside to teach the seminar. I was the only undergraduate and the only female in the seminar. And it was conducted in Healy basement. At that time, the basement of Healy was the new psychology department. And the psychology department was started and run by a Dr. Arnold Mesior. And Dr. Arnold Mesior had come to some of these dean's seminars as well. I'd met him after I came back from my trip to behind the Iron Curtain with the Circumnavigators Fellowship. And we talked, and he invited me to this course. Dr. Arnold Mesior was born in Poland. He spoke, I think, 6 languages. He's from a Jewish family. He had escaped to Palestine in those days when it was under the British protectorate in the late 1930s. And then from there to New York, where he studied music. He was a musician as well as then became a psychologist. He was working with the OSS, and he was working with different government organizations. He never told us he worked with the CIA, but there was mention of intelligence quite a bit in our seminars. And he was the head of the seminar and later became, I'll talk about the other program I was in with him.
How do you spell his last name?
Mysior. I believe I sent you a link with one of his
Okay, shoot, I missed it.
biographies. Arnold Mesior, Dr. Arnold Mesior. There's not much on the net about him. He died a number of years ago in his 90s. He designed a number and created a number of courses himself. The Psycho-Cybernetics was his course. We had Dr. Jack Schumann, who was a sociologist. We had Dr. Alexander Christakis, a physicist, originally from Crete, and I believe he's still alive on Crete. And his son works at Yale in a different field. Dr. Jack Schumann, Dr. Arnold Mesior, Dr. Alexander Christakis, and Alexander Haig, General Alexander Haig.
Wow. So does this look like him right here? MYSIOR?
Yeah, that's him.
Okay, gotcha.
And others who would come in from time to time, but those were the four main ones, covering different subjects, covering geopolitics, covering psychology, covering philosophy, ethics, studying strategy, military history. And I was closest to both Dr. Misior and General Haig. And General Haig became a kind of mentor of mine. He took me to the Pentagon, introduced me to, at that time, one of the female colonels, and went into his office and talked about possible careers. And that was during the tumultuous time, not only the Vietnam War, but politically. I think he was slandered after what happened with the Reagan assassination later on, and he had come out and made a statement that was misinterpreted in the press. He was a brilliant man.
Probably deliberately, right? He said, I'll take over or something. Yeah.
Yes. And he became secretary. Anyway, you can imagine there were only 6 students and pretty much as many professors, or let's say faculty. That was a change in my life, as well as looking at the world differently. I remember, just as a kind of a break thing to do, is we had big games of Risk. Risk is a board game, except that we would change it and have nuclear weapons in it. And we would, at that time, the strategy, I think it shifted in 73, around there, from MAD, mutual assured destruction, as in you would never use these nuclear weapons, or as an absolute last resort in defense, to NUT. I'm sorry I'm using these acronyms, but they're important. Nuclear Utilization Tactical Strategy, which is what we're still on today. Giving us practice for doing these strategies. In a way, it's like wargaming, role-playing. And they would watch us, and they would probably take notes on us, how we reacted. We were given scenarios and asked what we would do in this situation. One of them I remember is there had been one American intelligence officer who was a pilot who had crashed behind the Iron Curtain. His name eludes me at the moment, but he apparently was being tortured, and he wouldn't, in those days, I'm not sure exactly what they gave them, if it was cyanide in their teeth or the other thing, but you're supposed to commit suicide if you ever got caught. And he hadn't. And they were asking us as a scenario, if this was a scenario, we found out later it was true, there really had been, but in the time it was presented as a kind of a game. If you had this person and you didn't want them to reveal, what would you do in order to, I'm sorry, I forgot the biggest part, is that some of us were tested. I was one of the tested. I'd already had this ability as a child to excarnate and to see things outside my body and to know where things and people were. I didn't know why I knew it. I just knew it. And so I was tested for remote viewing early on in 1972 and then in 73. And I think it was in conjunction with Duke University Psychical Research Center. At the time, there was a kind of Soviet, it was thought that the Soviets were investigating this field much more than the Americans. And the Israelis were too, I believe. And there was a book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. I don't know if you've read it, William.
No, but I've done something on Soviet cybernetics, so I know that they were involved in that as well. And it went all the way around the world, Chile, Tundra, Allende, and all that stuff. So you're right there at that time. Like Chile was what, 70, early 70s, yeah, early 70s.
Mm-hmm. So this was Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, because they were already doing these research before the Americans were. And so there was a push, and I'm sure that's part of the reason they came to Georgetown University, because the remote viewing sector ended up being in the tri-state area for the military and government. Tri-state meaning Virginia, Maryland, and DC. So they asked me, and I think maybe one other person, but they asked me in a remote viewing sense, would there be a possibility of introducing what people may now know as inception, is an idea telepathically to this person to make them kill themselves.
Wow.
And I had a little bit of guilt about this for years afterwards because, you know, there's a big competition. It's a competitive school anyway, and these seminars were very competitive, people showing off how smart they are, and it's an ego thing. And I gave them...
I've been in seminars at Berkeley, so I had to do seminars. I know exactly what it's like. A table, you're stuck at a table with people sometimes for an hour or 2 hours. So yeah, sorry.
No, please contribute. So I did give them a suggestion of how they could do it so that they could bypass what our normal instinct is, which is self-preservation. And I think because I gave that suggestion, I was then referred for a special program. And Dr. Misior was the head of that program, and that involved private sessions, it involved hypnosis, and it involved inceptions, putting ideas into my mind in order to change some aspects of... Some of it was very positive because I was having nightmares. It's amazing. My entire lower body is shaking right now. Excuse me.
I'm sorry. It's probably really scary. One of the interesting things too is that this kind of self-negation is in Scientology, which has a lot of this information bled into Scientology around that time. Scientology is coming up right when they're doing a lot of this research in the 50s and 60s. And it's also in this kind of mega mind control film called The Manchurian Candidate, which is about a mind-controlled assassin that's sent from Russia, right? He's captured in Manchuria, which is the communist bloc or whatever. But he's programmed with a suicide program. That was something they were thinking about at the time. So Richard Condon in 1959 wrote the book, and then it was...
There were 2 films made about it, one in the 60s, I believe, and then an excellent one with Denzel Washington.
Yeah, I like the first one. But the first one's very interesting because a lot of people don't know this, but the background, it was all kind of greenlit by John F. Kennedy. It was actually, he loved the book. He liked spy novels. We know he liked James Bond, but he actually was friends with Sinatra. He said, let's get this movie made. And it got made, and then it was shelved for 25 years. It literally collected dust. It was not available. This is before the internet or anything like that. And there's reasons why, because it had a lot of this information from them. We call MKULTRA behavioral psychology, around Cold War behavior psychology was all integrated into that film, which included this kind of suicide protocol.
Yes. And all right, so I agreed to this hypnosis. Originally was trying to exorcise these nightmares that I had, and that was very productive. What it involved was a hypnosis first with Dr. Misior one-on-one in Healy Basement. And I will talk about a little bit of the programming that goes into that, where first you're taught to meditate. You're taught to relax, control your breathing, clear your mind, to be ready for what they're going to insert. And you sit in a chair. It's not lying down, and you're sitting upright across. I was from Dr. Misior. He had a very soothing voice, and he would count. He would guide you through a guided meditation. One of them that I remember he used quite often is that we were going down a hall to a door, and then he would open the door, and I would go through by myself. to another corridor, and it would be getting darker, and then go down to another hallway, open the door, go through another. I think he could probably see, because he had his eyes open, I had my eyes closed, if my breathing changed, if I was going deeper. At the time, I didn't realize it, but I look now what I know, and he was probably making sure before I go to the next door that I was at the correct alpha, beta, gamma level. And then the last door, I was directed to go down the steps. There were always a different number of steps. And when I got to the bottom of the step, open another door, and this time I was in a kind of forest with a path. Sometimes in the hypnosis section, sometimes I'd be asked to walk through, and sometimes, I remember a couple of times there was a bicycle by a tree, and I was to find it, get on the bicycle, and then the wheels would be turning, which would be another level deeper into the hypnosis. And then I would be instructed to either walk further into the forest, deeper and deeper, or ride deeper and deeper. And then at some point, I didn't remember what happened after that, but then it would be quite a long time after, at least 20 or 30 minutes, that I would be back in the forest, back at the steps, instructed to go up the steps, through those corridors again. And then to the last door, again, Dr. Mesior would open it, I would go through, and then he would say, you're back in the room, you're at Georgetown, you will, sometimes it was remember everything, but sometimes it was, I don't know, because I didn't remember anything from what had happened.
Wow. Mm-hmm. This is like validated by I've read a lot on hypnosis, and this is what they do, induction and slow, and the deepest levels of the human mind really is where they're trying to take you.
And what I had to do, it's true, and it's been done now, so I can talk about the process. I wouldn't want anybody to try it either for positive or negative without knowing what they're doing. But why I trusted him is because when we first started it, he would give me an idea, an inception, that as part of homework, that before I would go to sleep, if I thought I might have these recurring nightmares, which came from my past. I had a lot of violence in my past as a child, that I would tell myself a strategy that I could use within the dream. For example, if I had a dream where men were chasing me, I could say to myself, make it like an affirmation inserted into the nightmare, I can fly away this time. I can fly away from these dangers. Or I would have an inception, you can change the channel. They used channel in those days, not screen. You can change the channel. And then I would insert in my mind, before I went to bed even, and write it down, I can change the channel. I can fly. Fly really worked for me. Flying and swimming worked for me. It's different for different people. And we did that first for a number of weeks, and that really worked. And so I thought, wow, this is fantastic. You know, I can just do it myself. I can have this neurological control. And I can sleep better, and my mind is open better. They had already seen through me being in the seminar, I still kept one of the essays where they all wrote on it, this is remarkable, da, da, da. And I look back now at it, and they asked us for a different solution to the Vietnam War. This was in 1974. And I had written strategies that used economics and used psychological operations. I didn't know that's what it was at the time, how to change the mindset of the population. They really liked that. You know, a lot of college students now are a lot more knowledgeable and savvy because of what's on the internet. But at the time, I wasn't, none of us were. And
there was nothing. You still had to go to get punch cards at the library and filter through. Like that's where it was at the time, right? Those go find me cards. Does this look like Haley Hall? Is that the hall you were in?
Well, that's the hall.
Familiar at all?
Yes, it's in the basement.
That's it. Okay.
It's different
in the
now.
basement there.
It's different now, of course.
Okay.
They've taken the psychology department out of the basement.
Okay. But it's right there in the center of Georgetown University.
Yes, right.
I think the famous steps are very close to this somewhere.
The M Street steps are outside. Yeah. It's further down 2 streets away.
Yeah, I think this is it.
So
there.
I hope this is clear what I'm talking about.
It's clear to me. Maybe the listener, they'll have to listen to it once or twice. But the context of everything you say rings true. I was there 20 years after you, but the whole environment is like that. And it's interesting, like the talent spotting element. I remember from law school, like this, they're sifting through the candidates. Like there's, 200 or 300 of us, but you don't know the professors aren't just looking at your scholastic records. They're trying to see if they can fit you into the security state. Like this is a guy who's going to be good with languages, or this is a guy with no conscience, or this is a guy who's, yes, technically astute. That's happened. I can't remember this professor's name, but I found out later, like he was high up in the intel stuff, and he had the most coveted office of the professorship at my law school. And there was something special about him even back then, and now I know why. He was like a, Brahmin, pure blood, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant WASP. And I think that was part of his role. Like he had pre-retired. He was still teaching, but he was also, having fun kind of looking at the lab rats, so to speak, and it's in a very strange way.
I will talk a little more about the inception because I've had to process through the rest of my life to try and retrieve what some of those might have been and paste them in a way, memory-wise, with the decisions I took afterwards, and then reflect, was this really my decision or was I actually being programmed and I didn't realize it?
So like post-hypnotic suggestions. So maybe you've been suggested.
Well, they were hypnotic suggestions as well. And as I would call them inceptions, because I think that movie really demonstrates in a Hollywood type of way what happens. Right. And it's not a direct, like in a lot of old movies where you will, you will put a fork in your hand and feel no pain, or you will fall off the chair, or it's much, much more subtle. This was more subtle than that. And it directed, I know, certain decisions I made of travel right after I left Georgetown. And then when I decided I wasn't going to work for the government, and I was going to, when I got back from the Middle East, Northern Africa traveling in 1975, I decided that I actually wanted to pursue my personal pursuit was going to be the performing arts. And I wanted to apply for Circle in the Square Professional Drama School in New York. It was a very good school in New York. And I told him, because I was keeping in contact, that was the other post-hypnotic suggestion that I figured out after a while, is that I was supposed to call him at certain times, even if I didn't see him. And we met in person before I went to New York, and he said he didn't think it was a good idea for going to performing arts school. And I was wondering why. And he would say, you have so much more to offer, and give me all these kind of arguments about why I should work for at least someplace in the government. Originally, it was the Atomic Energy Commission, I think. I mean, it was working in there. My grandmother was a physicist on Enrico Fermi's team in Italy, nuclear physics. My father worked in the nuclear industry. I don't know, maybe that was part of the reason they thought that would be the first placement. Anyway, my father had worked in Iran in those days. I did get in to Circle in the Square, and I remember within the first few months, I called him. I was supposed to call him at certain times, and I was actually doing a different dance class or dance rehearsal, and I actually forgot. First time I really forgot. And when I called him, he was really angry, and we made another time to call. And I decided to miss that call. And that started my doors opening in my brain, because at first my whole body started to react about not following that dictum.
So he had done a post-hypnotic suggestion on you, probably.
Oh, I
And
think he had done a
he
few.
was in a handler position then. That means he was kind of
Yes.
your hand. He set himself up as your handler. This stuff is unbelievable. To somebody who hasn't read the background research, there's so much research about hypnosis, and it's really a skill unto itself. But these are classic.
Yes.
This reflects Manchurian Candidate as well. Sorry.
Then a few months later, I get a phone call as a not only was I a Foreign Service alumni, but I was also the first female to win the Circumnavigators Fellowship, which was a fellowship with a lot of high power players, you'd call them in those days, all male club at that point. And I would get invited to these receptions in New York, since I was in New York. And I didn't go sometimes. And one of the times I think it was also still through Dr. Misior, and that coterie of people. I got a phone call from a young man. He was Chinese German, American. I mean, definitely American accent. And he said that he was sent by so-and-so from the Circumnavigators Fellowship, and he would like to meet me. I lived in the Village for 8 years in New York, on the corner of Bleecker and McDougal, and there were a lot of cafes around there. And I said, yeah, I'll meet you at a cafe there. And he had quite a story. His parents were imprisoned. I think the story was real. His mother had been in prison for quite a few years, but his father was still in prison. Anyway, we had a long talk, and then he asked if he could come up to the apartment. And I remember instinctually I was hesitating, but then I thought, okay, you can come visit. I had a roommate from Circle Square. She wasn't there at the time, but I thought, okay. And I realized when he came in and he asked for a cup of coffee or something, and that he was looking at all my books and just looking. And he just gave me also some advice at the time. And I didn't think too much of it, but part of me must have responded, because I just thought I should call Dr. Misior. We didn't end on a very good note, and I should call him.
Wow. So you had the suggestion to do that.
And it could have been personal. I don't know. I'm looking back. I still don't know something. So but by that time,
sorry to interrupt, but do you consciously feel that you kind of had a close relationship with him? Or was it more?
I definitely did. I mean, he helped me in many ways too.
Okay. Did you see him with other people as well? So he kind of was more kind of a personal, maybe more personal than objective as a professor. Like some professors are very standoffish.
No, he wasn't. He was a very warm, compassionate, it seemed. I think anything that all of those professors who had survived World War II were doing were honestly for the good of America at that point. It was still the Cold War. I was all on board with helping America too. I mean, the Kennedy Center for Bioethics was just being talked about there. It was after the Kennedy assassinations, and people were very committed to making sure America stayed strong in any way possible. And some people may not agree with this, but that sometimes there were different programs that hadn't been tried. I'm not saying that everything that they did to me or with me was right, but some of that, I do believe he was in the best interest most of the time, first of all, of what, let's just say, the agenda or the mission was, but also of the person. I mean, he also met my parents. I look back and think, well, maybe he wanted to meet my parents, and my parents were going to come up, and my youngest brother was with them at the time, and he was asking my youngest brother questions. We were having lunch together. That's when I realized he was scrutinizing everybody because I knew some of those kind of questions, and I knew they seemed harmless. I think my brother was 7 or 8 at the time, but he was asking him some puzzles and anagrams making
so
it
it's kind of
sound.
like an off-the-cuff IQ test to see how smart or how
To see,
perceptive he
yeah.
was.
And he told me later of certain things about my brother. Yeah, as I say, upon reflection, and because we're so much more sophisticated now in terms of how much we know about these kinds of pattern recognition and psychology, quote unquote, test, of which a lot of them, have been debunked, but they used them at the time. And he was using them. And that was before I went to New York. And so I started knowing some aspects of them I hadn't seen when I was at Georgetown.
But it's interesting you say that because they really had a lot of faith in these personality things. It's still in Scientology, the personality test, but there was a big thing that Leary was involved in.
Yes.
Gittinger, who was another MK dog, CIA, whatever you want to term him.
Eric
He did,
Fromm.
a lot of them had these tests. They would just bombard you with questions and things like that. And I think
they made it as the new science. Well, they do it now with data, in a way, right?
You're right.
Absolutely. Data is the new mythology.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
You can't really know about a person just from those external.
They had a lot more faith in that kind of science back then. I think that's
I don't know about that because when I went through Army training later on, they gave us a lot of psychological tests and they took a lot of stock in it. So
right. Yeah, right. I mean, anyway, it's incredible. So like you had this meteor. When did so how long was your kind of contacts?
My contact finished with him in the early 80s. And by that time, I believe he had left Georgetown as well for private practice. And then my life was different because I was in the performing arts fully on in all the unions, and that was going to be my profession until life dealt me some different turns. And
Circle in the Square is still there too. So.
Yes, it is. It's very different, but still there. And again, Circle in the Square had people on its board and would come to talk to us, and people like George C. Scott and Thomas Mann and Dustin Hoffman, and it was great training as well. And it was during that training that one of my, I think he's still there, Michael Kahn, he was director of the Folger Theater in Washington until just recently, because I went and saw a play there a few years ago and realized he was still, must be in his 90s now. Anyway, during Circle in the Square is when I realized I needed to do some more psychological work. There were some things. When I went to the Circumnavigators Fellowship, still to this day, I do not know where 3 days of my life went when I was transferred from Moscow to Krakow, Poland, and was waiting on a flight for 3 days. But the only thing I remember was getting on that flight in Moscow, Aeroflot, and landing in Krakow. Somebody met me, and the next 3 days are blank. And then the next thing I know, I'm on a flight to Houston. It still bothers me. What happened to those 3 days?
Right. It's interesting you say that, because also I'm going to send this article. It's about somebody kind of like you. Her name was, well, it's a fake name, but it was done by Hank Albarelli. I don't know if you know that name, but he did a book on Olson, who was one of the early, he was thrown out of the window. But she tells similar stories. Georgetown, bigwigs, memory loss, confusion. I
graduated from Circle in the Square in New York in 1980, by the way.
Okay, gotcha. Anyway, I'll send you this. It's very, I think you'll find the article very interesting.
Yes.
You have to see it, because he had something happen to him. Since I've been doing this kind of research, people have come to me and been presented to me. You is kind of different because I reached out to you, told me, and I reached out to you. He had the same thing, and he couldn't contextualize it as well. Maybe somebody else could. He retold their stories, but he left it up to the listener to ascertain the veracity of those things. But I think you'll find this. We don't have time to go over it right now, but it's a really interesting article. I'll send it to you. It's called
Thank you.
The Strange Story of Sally Hartman. It's a little bit of memory loss here and there, and strained relationships that may have been strained because of something she went through. And yeah, but she got spiked. Like, I don't know if you recall getting spiked, but she was definitely spiked.
No, I will say I never really drank in my life anyway. I drank to see what it was like in high school, and and since I was a Chinese medical practitioner later on, I know I always carry acupuncture needles with me because there are points to make you instantly sober. I've used it on other people. What I was going to say is that when that happened, I told my grandmother and my aunt. My grandmother was a physicist. My father's mother and my father's sister was a psychologist, one of the first females to go through Harvard in the 50s for psychology, a graduate work in psychology. And they recommended I go to Dr. Charles Socarides, who's also much maligned on the web, but he was fantastic. But as it turned out, he also worked with naval special warfare, and he untuned some of that hypnosis with me. And we also went over psychotherapeutic techniques, which really helped me a lot. And if I didn't have that, I probably, my life would have been a lot worse. Dr. Socarides is much maligned because he's helped many, many people, they won't put that, who were sexually abused by the same gender when they were children. And now they'll call it gender identity confusion. And he had so I was treated by him. He was a friend of my aunts. They were colleagues at Harvard. So he knew my family and a little more about my family background as well, and he helped me considerably. And that was while I was in the performing arts in New York. And we untuned a lot. And then later on in my life, well, it was in New York as well that I was first introduced to the American Indian movement and the American Indian, Native American.
AIM, right? AIM. Yeah.
Well, some AIM, but also more than that, it was more Native American rights. And I didn't meet Russell Means then. I saw Russell Means later in my life. But it was the Native American ceremonies as well as the Aboriginal ceremonies. I worked with indigenous populations for most of my life, including recently in Alaska. During the COVID restrictions, I was working in the Yupik and Chupik communities. We had our New Zealand citizenship because I worked with the Maori community, adopted into Ngāti Kahungunu and the Gumbangi Aboriginal tribes and Ngāti Kahungunu Maori tribes. So I've had the good fortune to have a lot of ceremonial work done over me and a lot of Chinese medicine in the esoteric part of Chinese medicine, what some people will refer to as the ghost points. And I was with the Shaolin in China in 2019, 2018. There are certain esoteric acupuncture points to recall memories, to put you on another level, because I was very concerned that I still might have programming that I didn't know about that could have affected me.
It's interesting you say that, because I'm thinking that question. Do you recall any symbols, words, phrases, things that we could do? Like, I mean, it add up to a trigger. Like,
we did discern a few.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I really want to say these.
And don't.
Yeah.
This is not that type of interview.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is a known thing. Like, they'll go into the recesses and there's a trigger. Like, if Sirhan, somebody touched his elbow, he would have an autonomic response. It was not a thing. And they had Sirhan climbing up the wall and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And they know somebody was that's just a whole nother story. But it's just like seeing you within the context of these things is like.
The positive part of some of these suggestions had to do with compartmentalization in terms of memorizing and compartmentalizing and pain. And because of the destiny of my life and what I've been subjected to later on in life, that helped me survive. I was unjustly imprisoned. I was tortured. I can look back now in my 70s and as a destiny, kind of looking back and go, all right, at the time I may not have understood why I had this training, for example. And later on, I realized that was very important for the situation I would be in.
Wow, it's amazing. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
like you went through this kind of at least
And
adjacent.
recognizing other people to an extent as well. There's
So
not
you
many.
recognize fellow travelers. Is that what you're saying?
We talked about this last time about psychonauts. I do recognize some of them, but also ceremonially going through the fasting and the kinds of ceremonies. I've always been taught to use it, even at Georgetown. I was taught, to whom much is given, much is expected, and you use these opportunities, educational opportunities, training opportunities, gifts and abilities you've been God-given, you use them for good, or this will not turn out well for you.
People need to be warned about this because these kind of weird things are still happening. There's a lot of
Yes.
yeah. There's a lot
Yes,
of
because all our adversaries, all the worst kinds of, whether it's criminal networks, terrorist networks, you don't think they know all of this? They do. They know it, and they use even what we perhaps drew the line at not using. They cross the line.
They've crossed over into the beyond. They've used Hippocratic Oath as toilet paper. Is something I've said. Like, it's incredible. These people, Jabbar, Livelsberger, Crooks, Ruth. Ruth looks like to me a guy who's been tampered with, like, incredibly. He was the so-called second Trump shooter at Mar-a-Lago, and then the guy who went through amazing personality change was the kid who shot the CEO in Manhattan. What was his name? It escapes me. I see his face. He had an Italian last name, but
no need to give them visibility. That's part of what's wanted. Just like the shooter in Colorado movie theater years ago. Yeah. I mean, there's
these people underwent amazing.
I don't know why they've done it.
Right, but they underwent amazing personality changes. Luigi Mangione was his name. This guy was like you. He was like super high functioning in best school. What's that
to me?
Well, I'm just saying, like, you're at the higher level of this kind of. I would say that you're at a higher level of the spectrum. If you go to Georgetown and some of these other places, then your family has this kind of history. And these guys all knew each other. That's why I'm bringing up this picture of Sikter, because he probably knew Mizior and all these other characters at Georgetown. Usually the faculty pretty much know each other, especially at a semi-smaller university. Georgetown isn't like...
Oh, that time it was much smaller than it is now.
Yeah, it's not a big state school. I just want to bring up this other document. But I thank you so much for sharing your story and what you did. And I think it's enough. People, do not mess around with this hypnotic stuff. I've said it's the Rosetta Stone of the 20th century. And it is kind of history. If you know this kind of underground history that's not talked about, it's compartmentalized for a reason. But you go back in Hitler, and I mean, that's a whole nother show. I'll do another show on the history of.
Well, a lot of those tactics used
politically
strategies found by twisting positive Tibetan mysticism, let's say, that the Nazis used in a dark way, and then they were deliberately brought to the United States in Operation Paperclip, disseminated in different parts of the United States, different universities, different think tanks for the rest of their lives. And they've been perfected with the Tavistock Institute in London, and different research in different parts of the world. And now the tactics, the strategies are much more sophisticated, but the basis of them is the same.
Very well said. This is kind of a document that it's adjacent subpart 35 MKUltra, but this is them, right? This is Helms. This is when he wasn't the head of CIA, but before that, he's working under Dulles. And this is them putting together this new thing. I'm pretty sure Gesikter's name is blocked out here because I know he was a cancer researcher, bone cancer. But this is an enormous amount of money at the time. 54, they were getting $3 million to build another thing called Gorman Hall, which I can pull up right now at Georgetown. And they were doing all these matching funds and stuff donated by the CIA, all covered under this Gesikter fund, which showed they're writing it down. they're just showing that it keeps the hands off the CIA. So these guys can operate surreptitiously. It's just off the charts.
Use science. I mean, look what happened with the COVID restrictions and the COVID strategy that was planned years before with scientists and doctors. And what do you think's being planned still? Yes.
These are techniques they were using. They're using drugs, but putting them in a technique. And I think that's very important. Biochemical stuff. You can read all this. It'll be the equivalent of a hospital safe house. So they're thinking about it on intellectual terms, like a spy. That's a safe house is like a spy term, where they have safe places to go. And then recruiting new scientific personnel as members. So it's not just to find people who are going to be patients or whatever, or victims, however you want to put it, but to actually find more people to get involved in the
Yes,
program.
and I'll tell you which network does this. I know this firsthand from working in medical universities in Armenia and in Ukraine for a program through the State Department in Georgetown. And OSIN, the Open Society University Network, sponsors a lot of medical conferences, including the prestigious Salzburg medical conferences. One of my jobs at the time, before I really knew what OSIN did, was identifying medical residents and doctors that I worked with at the medical university to go to those conferences. And at those conferences, often they would be recruited there if they weren't aware. I did role play with my medical residents and doctors before they went to advise them of some of the tactics that they might use to not take the drinks, to not give them their personal phone numbers. And that's still going on. They especially do it in places like Albania, places where the economics is a challenge. Most doctors in a lot of those countries, especially during the Soviet Union, they didn't get paid very much money at all. It wasn't like in the West. And so if you offered them more money or you compromised them, then they had you for life.
Yeah, maybe talking about this international is a good place to segue away from this to your article about Armenia and Azerbaijan back in the news. Like your topography and knowledge of the world is probably in a very, elite group, but because you've traveled so many different places, it's amazing you were in Alaska, because now today,
I know
Putin and Trump are supposedly working out peace. People pray for peace. There's 2 million dead people there at the border. We never see it in our controlled media, but it's a catastrophe, including Gaza, which is like almost nearing 500,000 dead people, which they're never going to.
I will disagree with you about the whole Gaza narrative, but we won't talk about that. We'll talk about Armenia.
Please do.
Yeah.
Tell me about your article. I'm going to bring up your Substack right now.
Thank you.
Let's see if I can find it. Let me bring this up. I'm going to bring up just to show the audience this one. This is the one I was mentioning. Share screen. This is the article I was talking about. The strange story of Sally Hartman. That was in truthout.org. Great website. So check that out. And then let me see if I can bring this up. Share screen. There it is. Here we go. There we go. This is your Substack, which I will bring up, Joe's blog. And it's the top article just written 2 days ago. Can you talk a little bit about that, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and what's happened?
Yes. I was in Armenia a while ago, 2008 to 2010. And I was at the Yerevan. My main base was Yerevan State Medical University after Haradzi. And I also I was always paid through the US government, but the Center for Medical Genetics, because Armenians are a very homogeneous population still, and they have certain genetic conditions and diseases that are passed down that they really want to address. And I worked with I was part of the American Council in both there and in Russia. So I worked in all different sectors of Armenian society, but mainly with the medical profession, but also with the political through American councils. That's really like a Voice of America outreach. in person in the different countries that the State Department has the American consuls. And fortunately, a lot of my colleagues, Armenian is a very difficult language for me. I mean, I learned how to speak it passively in the 2 years, how to go shopping, how to do the greetings, how to understand a fair bit, and I learned some Russian there before I ended up going to Russia after that. The Armenians are a very unique people. I didn't know about them before I was sent there, and I don't think most people do, because now it's considered a very small country, and often people don't think it's significant. From a spiritual religious point of view, it's a place that has sacred sites that no other place on the planet has for Christianity. And a lot of those sacred sites were in, I'll just mention a little bit of background. I mean, Armenia is a very ancient civilization, and it still has the longest continuing capital city of Yerevan. But they were a great empire at one point. And they were overrun by a number of different empires, including the Persians, the Ottomans, and you can say the Soviet Union, in a way, as an empire, overran them. And they were the first country to declare itself a Christian country and actually declare that. And so a lot of sacred sites are there. They are mostly more Orthodox than people would consider Christian, especially evangelical Christians in the United States. They are a more Orthodox version of Christianity, closer to the original Christianity. And so they have sites there from hundreds of years, thousands of years. And a lot of those sacred sites, not all of them, but a lot of them were in Nagorno-Artsakh region, which there's been a conflict over for many years. And it's partly because of the division that the Soviet Union did for its own strategy. And I'll just talk recent history because we don't have so much time. And I had medical students from Nagorno-Karabakh, wonderful students. I was never allowed to go there when I was working with the State Department because it was considered a danger zone, no-go. And because even back then in 2010, there was a pivot towards Azerbaijan rather than Armenia, even though there's a great diaspora of Armenians in the United States. Why? Well, because Baku and the natural resources of Azerbaijan seem to be more profitable than Armenia, which doesn't have the oil and gas. That's my viewpoint. And the other is that Armenia is pretty much surrounded by Islamic theocratic regimes. Azerbaijan, even though it says it's a democratic republic, it's an Islamic country fully. So is Turkey. And Iran certainly is a theocracy. Only Georgia sort of stays out of the way of that and has more religious freedom. But Armenia declared itself a Christian country, and that made it a target, as well as the fact that geopolitically, it's an incredibly pivot point for pipelines to go through, whether it's from Russia or whether it's from Iran. Armenia is right in that location. A lot of people in a lot of leadership positions are vying for. And because of the horrors of the Soviet Union, not only in Ukraine with Holodomor and starving people to death, but Armenia suffered greatly under the Soviet Union. And they were promised in 1991 by the United States that there would be support for Armenia declaring its independence. But that support really has been unreliable from many administrations in the United States. And partly the reason, a great part of the reason for that, not only in my opinion, is because the United States has allied with Turkey, has allowed Turkey into NATO. You see how big Turkey is. The population alone, I mean, Armenians, a lot of them left during and especially after the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they have a greater diaspora. They have between 7 and 10 million Armenians in different countries, a lot in the United States, a lot in Russia, some in other countries. And they only have about 3 million of their own population there. So
Right, it's
population.
amazing. And they used to have more. Turkey,
Oh,
well,
yes.
they won't admit the Armenian genocide to this day. I've had Benny Morris, probably one of the greatest historians, about he calls it a 30-year war against, it also involved Greeks too, but
Yes.
Turks really, they kind of got the Jewish treatment, got blamed for the loss of Ottoman Empire and World War One, and so they were the scapegoats and they were treated miserably. So
There's so much, the hatred that is fostered, because children don't come into the world having hatred for different countries and ethnicities. They're taught that. And that's reinforced in the education system, in the government system, in the military system, in the justice system. So the hatred against Armenians by the Turks is legendary. And the allies, the allied countries after World War I essentially carved up Armenia and gave a lot of that land to Turkey, even though Turkey committed the first documented under all international law, legal standards, genocide against the Armenians. So you have a country that's surrounded pretty much, with the exception of Georgia, by enemies.
yeah, and some pretty tough customers.
And Azerbaijan was part of the Soviet Union, has allied with the Islamists. They say they don't, but they have, if you look at their policies. And it's, again, a chessboard. Both Azerbaijan and Armenia are part of the chessboard for the big power players, Russia, the United States, Iran, and Turkey, in this sense.
Right. And the United States just signed a 99-year lease, right?
Yes.
So what the heck is the United States doing in this kind of, like you said, this pivot point? And a lot of the native people local there are nervous, Iran and stuff like that. And I think there was a story that this most recent decapitation.
Well, I'll give a firsthand example. Even back in 2008, well, in 2008, many of the Armenians who were in Syria, in Aleppo, started exiting and coming to Armenia, because even as far back as 2008, they started to see the Islamists and the really terrorist factions in Aleppo start to change the society, which prior to that, Muslims and Christians and Catholics had gotten along quite well. And then suddenly their stores were being attacked. Their sisters and their mothers, females, couldn't go out uncovered. That started back in the 2000s. And you saw an emigration from Syrian Armenians and from Iranian Armenians back to Armenia, or if they couldn't stay in Armenia, then someplace else. But that happened quite a long time ago, during the time that the Nagorno-Karabakh war would sometimes spark up and then die down, spark up and die down. And then if you look at the Obama administration, well, even before, we know now all the billions of dollars that was sent to Iran. And you have a very strange situation for Israel, where they were selling some of their weapons to Azerbaijan, and yet at the same time, on some policies coming out for Armenia. And you see the rationale was, we want to have a bulwark against Iran, and Azerbaijan is still, for the most part, aligned with countries who don't want Iran's theocracy to succeed. So you have a very difficult situation, and in the sense of peace, because what happened is Turkey, which is the world's largest producer and exporter of drones, military drones, far exceeding the United States and China in terms of percentage, they started using all sorts of drones on the Armenians. Terrible injuries. They just didn't know literally what hit them. And that really brought Armenia to its knees against Azerbaijan. So Turkey continued its hatred, in this proxy war as well. They got involved. And Armenia, what could it do? If you look at my article, I have the statistics about the populations of countries that are aligned with Azerbaijan and Turkey and the population of Armenia, even if it's there.
Tiny comparison.
There's just no comparison. It's hundreds of millions against a few million. And the production and the industry and the trade routes, really what this is about now in terms of the United States, it's let's hope that in a way you can say greed and business supersede the hatred so that they will keep the corridor for the pipelines for oil and gas and other transit for trade open. I'm afraid, I think a lot of Armenians are afraid that the Armenians are going to become literally slaves in a way in their own country. And if you acknowledge the worldwide caliphate dictate by Islamists, they don't hide it. What do you think is going to happen to Armenia and Armenians surrounded by Islamists?
Carved up, sold into slavery.
Yes, besides slaughtering a lot of the people of of the Armenians, what did they do, the Azerbaijanis? They deliberately destroyed all the ancient sites of Christianity.
That's what they always do. All the Islamists just go destroy churches and stuff like that. I live in LA, so I know the Armenian. There's a very predominant Armenian population here, and they have all kinds of signs and stuff of remembering their relatives were murdered. So not that long ago, like right before the World War II. So
and continues in different ways.
Right. So the conflict always continues. That's the whole thing about like what's happening in Gaza, like the
please don't bring up Gaza.
Okay.
Because that should be a whole nother podcast. And I do have a vehement disagreement. And I was just in that area last year. So people who haven't been there and don't really know what's going on, I don't want to engage in a conversation unless we really talk about it seriously. And this conversation is not about that. I value your investigation. I think this is important because it's so small. Most people don't want to know about it and don't think it's going to affect them. It will affect them.
It's just another base on the American empire, right? Is like this, what's the so-called peace agreement and the U.S.'s presence there. Isn't it another base surrounding Russia too? Russia and Iran by the U.S.?
Yes. One has to wonder, isn't it time for a foreign policy shift? I think Secretary Rubio is doing an excellent job with so many fires having to been put out at once from all the disastrous decisions made over the last 4 years and under the Obama administration and, even the Bush and Clinton administration, if you go way back, in terms of the long-term consequences of those decisions are affecting us now and affecting most of the world now in an adverse way. But I do think it's better to have friends than enemies. It's better to have trade, if nothing else, than war. And I would say probably just about everybody that's not a psychopath in those countries would feel the same.
I agree with you.
And the former Soviet Union countries, they were their own countries before they were subsumed into this quote unquote union. And the union never really worked out that way. And so now some of these grievances are coming back with all the sophisticated weapons we have and all the sophisticated surveillance that we have.
Yeah, you're right. Joe, we are at the 90-minute mark. It's gone fast. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for sharing your story. And I hope
these are just my opinions as well politically, but if you want to look at my Substack, and I always write only about countries that I've lived in, worked in, have a direct association with.
And I just showed your picture right there on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it'll probably be in the news again. Like, I don't think this is going to go away, a lot of this stuff. So I will put a link to your Substack and a link to your books. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed before we wrap it up?
Yes. If you go down on my Substack, you'll see Let's Talk Turkey. since we've been talking about Armenia, you really have to talk Turkey too. And since Russia's representatives are in the United States right now in Alaska, that alliance between Turkey and Russia is probably another reason why the United States felt compelled and a time urgency to try and get this peace settlement. Look who Erdogan, president of Turkey, is aligned with now. The Islamist jihadist barbaric al-Jilani.
Yeah, just did a great show on the whole situation in Syria called Creative Chaos. And it's chaotic in Syria. And this guy's kind of like
I think you should, for people who want to know more about Afghanistan Islamists, but Islamists in general, and she's come forward more on social media, is look at Sarah Adams, very easy name, Sarah Adams, on X. I don't think she's on Instagram or others, and she's been on Sean Ryan and Chad Robideau's Resilient Show and Sean Ryan's podcast, and she gives, that's her corridor, I won't even say lane, that's her whole corridor, and that's her expertise. And I hope more American foreign policies leaders and regular Americans just read and listen to her as well about what's coming if we don't do something right now.
Gotcha. And again, it's Patti Munisteri. Last name is spelled Munisteri. And we talked about her experiences at Georgetown with these kind of mind-controlled psychiatrists, psychologists, and then a little bit of Armenia and Azerbaijan. I'll put a link to her Substack and her books in our earlier chat. So thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, William.
All right, stay there.